The apartment door was slightly ajar. Richard Miller stopped in the narrow fifth-floor hallway, his keys still dangling from his index finger, his body begging for rest after another endless day underneath cars he would never get to drive. It was almost 10 at night on a typical Thursday in Chicago, and that sliver of light leaking through the half-open door was anything but typical. His first thought was a break-in. His heart raced. But thieves don't leave doors open, he thought. He pushed the wood slowly, bracing himself to find the apartment trashed, drawers on the floor, the old sofa ripped apart in search of money he never had to hide. What he found was infinitely more unsettling. A woman was in his kitchen, her back to him, washing dishes in the stained sink he had left full that morning. She was wearing a pearl grey tailored suit, the kind of outfit Richard only saw in magazines in waiting rooms. Her brown hair was pulled back into an elegant chignon, and even from a distance, it was obvious that every piece of clothing she wore cost more than he made in a year. Richard stood paralyzed in the doorway. The scene was so surreal that for a second he wondered if he had walked into the wrong apartment. But no, there was the old fridge with the Route 66 magnet. There was the Formica table that had belonged to his grandmother. There was the damp stain on the ceiling he'd never managed to fix. The woman turned around, and the plate she was holding almost slipped from her yellow rubber-gloved hands, which looked completely out of place against her immaculate suit. Richard recognized her immediately. It was impossible not to. That face graced the covers of business magazines, appeared in articles about the most powerful women in the country, and was cited in discussions about the future of the American automotive industry. Helen Vance, CEO of Vance Motors, the largest luxury car manufacturer in the nation. The exact same woman who 8 months ago had signed his father's termination papers. The anger came like a wave, hot and suffocating, rising from his stomach to his throat. Richard clenched his fists, his nails digging into palms still stained with grease that no soap could ever fully remove. "What are you doing in my house?" His voice came out more controlled than he expected, but laden with a cutting coldness. Helen slowly pulled off the gloves, as if she needed those extra seconds to find the right words. She opened her mouth, closed it, and tried again. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled in a way that didn't match the image of the ruthless executive he had of her. "I needed to come. I couldn't take it anymore." "Couldn't take what anymore?" Richard interrupted, taking a step inside and shutting the door behind him hard enough to make the frame rattle. "Couldn't sleep soundly after destroying my father's life? Did you come to offer money? Are you here to buy my silence?" "No." The word came out as a whisper. Helen set the gloves on the sink and turned completely toward him. Only then did Richard realize she was crying. They weren't discreet, controlled tears. They were tears falling freely, leaving streaks of mascara down her carefully made-up face. "I came because I didn't know any other way to." She stopped, brought her hands to her face, and took a deep breath. When she looked back at him, there was something in her brown eyes that made Richard hesitate. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't pity. It was desperation. "You don't understand," she continued, her voice breaking. "I had to do it. I needed to protect him, even if he would never know, even if you hated me, even if I hated myself. I had no choice." "Protect him?" Richard let out a bitter laugh. "You fired a 62-year-old man who gave 40 years of his life to that company. He walked in there as an apprentice mechanic and left as a production line supervisor. 40 years, Helen. And you threw him out on the street like he was disposable." "I know." The words sounded like a painful confession. "I know what I did, and you have no idea how you what? How bad you feel. How you lose sleep in your Gold Coast penthouse while my father wastes away in the next room, without even the strength to get out of bed." Richard felt his voice rising, months of exhaustion transforming into pure fury. He barely eats. He doesn't speak anymore. He just lays there staring at nothing like he's lost his reason to exist. And you know what the worst part is? I can't help him. I work 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and I can still barely cover the medical bills. So do not stand there and tell me how you feel." Helen swayed as if she'd been punched. She leaned against the sink, her back curved, her whole body trembling. For a long moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the irregular dripping of the old faucet. "I know you won't believe me," she finally said, still facing away from him. I know nothing I say will change anything now, but I need you to know the truth. I need at least one person in the world to know why I did what I did. Richard crossed his arms, defensive. Then talk. Helen turned around slowly. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, smudging her makeup even more, and suddenly looked much younger, almost vulnerable. When she spoke, her voice was steadier, but it carried a weight Richard couldn't quite identify. Your father, Arthur Miller. She swallowed hard. He is my father too. The apartment seemed to spin. Richard blinked, certain he had misheard. What did you say? I am his daughter. The words spilled out fast now, as if she needed to get them out before losing her nerve. I'm your half-sister, Richard, and I know how this must sound. I know you must think I've lost my mind, or that I'm trying to manipulate you, but I swear on everything sacred that I am telling the truth. Richard felt his legs give out. He leaned against the doorframe, trying to process words that seemed to make absolutely no sense. That's insane. My dad was married to my mom his whole life. He never. It was before the marriage. Helen took a step forward, her hands reaching out as if she wanted to touch him but didn't dare. My mother, Christine Vance, was a secretary at the plant over 40 years ago. She and your father had a brief affair just for a few months. When she found out she was pregnant, he was already engaged to your mother. Christine didn't want to interfere. She knew he loved that woman, that he had plans, a whole life mapped out. So she left. She quit her job, moved to California, and raised me on her own. Richard shook his head, refusing to believe it. If that were true, why are you telling me this now? Why didn't you look for my father sooner? Why wait until... Because I didn't know. Helen's voice was pure agony. I grew up believing my father had died before I was born. That's what my mother always told me. It was only when she passed away 3 years ago that she left a letter explaining everything, giving me his name, the plant's address, begging me not to look for him, not to destroy the family he had built. But you looked. It wasn't a question. Helen shook her head. Not the way you think. I didn't knock on his door, I didn't introduce myself, I just used my position. When I took over the company, I made sure to learn everything about him. I protected him without anyone knowing. I guaranteed better benefits, better shifts, discreet raises, all from the shadows, until you fired him. The company was sinking. Helen's voice rose for the first time. Desperate. We had to cut 300 employees, 300, and there were people on the board, dangerous people who were investigating favoritism and irregularities. If they found out I was giving special protection to an employee, they would dig, and if they dug, they'd find out you were father and daughter, Richard finished, starting to understand, and then everything would come out. The scandal would destroy him. It would destroy you. It would tarnish your mother's memory. I couldn't let that happen, so I made the only decision I could. I fired him first before anyone could use him against me, before his name showed up on any report, before he became a target. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with revelations that still needed to be digested. Richard looked at Helen, really looked at her, for the first time since he found her there, and that's when he noticed. The brown eyes with little golden flecks near the iris, the identical shape of the jaw, the way she bit her lower lip when she was nervous, exactly like his father did, exactly like he did. Why are you here? He asked, his voice softer now. Why come to my house to wash dishes? Helen let out a humorless laugh. Because working and giving orders is all I know how to do. Because money can't buy absolution. Because when I found out he was sick, that you were killing yourself to take care of him alone. She wiped her eyes again. I needed to do something real, something with my hands, something that mattered. Richard closed his eyes, feeling the exhaustion of years crashing down on his shoulders. When he opened them again, Helen was still there, standing in his humble kitchen, as out of place as she was genuine. How long have you been coming here? 3 weeks, always on Thursdays when you work late. I clean, I leave food ready, I take care of the things you don't have time to take care of. She gestured around the apartment. I know it's not much. I know it doesn't change anything, but it's all I have to offer besides the money I know you'd never accept. And she was right. He wouldn't accept it. But maybe, just maybe, he could accept this. Richard walked over to the table, pulled out a chair and sat down, suddenly hyper-aware of every aching muscle in his body. He looked at the woman who claimed to be his sister, and saw for the first time not the ruthless CEO, but a lost person trying to find her way home. "Do you like coffee?" he asked. Helen blinked, surprised. "Coffee? It's a simple question." Yes, I like coffee." Richard nodded to the chair across from him. "Then sit down. Let's talk." And as Helen Vance, one of the most powerful women in America, sat at a Formica table in a modest apartment on the outskirts of Chicago, Richard realized his life had just changed forever. The coffee was too strong, bitter the way it always got when Richard left it on the stove for too long. Helen held the old mug with both hands, as if she needed the warmth to anchor herself to reality. They sat in silence for long minutes, just drinking bad coffee in a kitchen that smelled of dish soap and exhaustion. "Tell me more," Richard said finally, his voice still laced with suspicion, but with an openness that hadn't been there before. "If this is all true, I need to know everything." Helen nodded, placing the mug on the table. "My mother was young when she started working at the plant. She was 22, freshly graduated with a business degree, and it was her first real job. Your father was 25. He'd already been working there for a few years as a mechanic. She said he was different from the other men, kind, funny, a dreamer." Richard felt a tightness in his chest. He knew the man in that description, or at least he used to, before the layoff stole all his light. "They grew close little by little," Helen continued, her eyes lost in memories that weren't hers, but that she had read and reread in her mother's letter until she'd memorized every word. Lunches together, conversations after hours. My mother knew it was wrong that she was getting too attached, but she couldn't help it. By the time they realized it, they were already involved. "And my mother?" Richard asked, his voice tense. "Where was she in all of this?" He was already spoken for, engaged for 6 months. My mother knew from the start, but the heart doesn't follow logic, does it? She thought that maybe, just maybe, he would choose to be with her. She was naive. She was foolish. Her words, not mine. Helen took a deep breath before continuing. "When she found out she was pregnant, your father had already set the wedding date. She went to him, planned to tell him everything, but when she got to his house, she saw your mother through the window. She saw how she smiled, how excited she was about the preparations, how she held his arm with so much love. And my mother realized she couldn't do it. She couldn't destroy that happiness over a mistake." "You aren't a mistake," Richard said, surprising himself. Helen looked at him, her eyes welling up again. "Thank you for saying that. But for a long time, I felt exactly like one. When I finally read the letter, when I found out my father wasn't dead but just inaccessible, it was like the ground vanished beneath my feet." Richard picked up his own mug, already cold, and took a sip anyway. His mind was working fast, connecting dots, looking for holes in the story. "Why did your mother tell you? Why not take this secret to the grave?" "Because she was dying, and she was terrified I would never know where I came from. She wanted me to have the choice to meet him, even knowing the risks. In the letter, she gave me all the details. His full name, where he worked, even your mother's name and yours. She had kept tabs on you from afar all those years." "That's unsettling," Richard muttered. "It is," Helen agreed. "But it's also understandable, isn't it? She loved that man. Even after leaving, even after building a different life, that love never completely faded. She needed to know he was okay, that he was happy." Richard stood up and started pacing the small kitchen. "When did your mother die?" 3 years ago, pancreatic cancer. It was fast, violent. I had just taken over as president of the company. I inherited from her not just the truth about my father, but also the Vance Motors shares that my grandfather had left her." "So you're wealthy by inheritance?" "Yes. My maternal grandfather built an empire from scratch. My mother was an only child, and so am I. When I took over the company at 33, I was the youngest CEO in the automotive sector. People thought I couldn't handle the pressure. I proved them wrong." There was pride in her voice, but also sadness. Richard could see now what he couldn't before. Helen was just as lonely as he was, just at a different altitude. What did you do when you found out about my father? Richard sat back down, leaning forward. Walk me through it. Helen wrapped her hands around the mug again. First, I panicked. Then, I hired private investigators. Discreet, professional ones. I needed to know everything before making any decisions. They brought me comprehensive reports. I found out Arthur Miller was an exemplary employee, respected, loved by his peers. I found out about your mother, who had passed away from breast cancer 10 years prior. I found out about you, a mechanic like your father, working at a third-party shop that serviced our company. You investigated me. I did, and I was impressed. You were only 28 at the time. But the shop owners said you were the best mechanic they'd ever hired. Golden hands, they said, just like his father. Richard didn't know how to feel about that. Invaded, but also strangely validated. After I gathered all the information, I made a decision. I wasn't going to seek you out directly. I wasn't going to disrupt your peace with revelations that would only bring pain and confusion. But I could protect you. I could make sure you had what you needed. My father's promotions, Richard said, putting it together. The raises. They weren't based on merit. They were, Helen shot back firmly. He deserved every penny. I just made sure the right people paid attention. I removed obstacles. When other managers tried to undermine him out of jealousy, I intervened subtly. When there was that discussion about early retirements 2 years ago, I took his name off the list before anyone even considered it. Richard dragged his hands down his face. And then came the crisis. The worst crisis in the company's 50-year history. We lost major contracts, our competitors launched models that beat ours in technology, and the international market went into a recession. We had to cut costs drastically, or the whole company would sink, taking 5,000 jobs with it. So you chose to sacrifice 300 to save the rest. Exactly. It was the hardest decision I've ever made. Every name on that list was a real person with a family, dreams, bills to pay. I spent sleepless nights reviewing the criteria, trying to make the process as fair as possible. And my dad ended up on the list. Helen closed her eyes. Your father didn't make the list based on technical criteria. He made it because the vice president of operations, a man named Roger Lawson, was investigating irregularities. He had noticed that certain employees were receiving preferential treatment without clear justification in the paperwork. Arthur was at the top of the suspect list. Richard felt his stomach churn. He was going to find out. He was, and if he found out, he wouldn't stop until he found the motive. Roger is meticulous, ambitious, and ruthless. If he discovered our connection, he would use it to take me down and take my place. And in the process, he would destroy your father's reputation. Make it look like he got his positions through shady favors. The press would love a story like that. Executive protects secret father, corrupts honest workers. So you fired him first. I pulled him out of the line of fire. I secured a generous severance package, way above the legal minimum. I wrote an exceptional letter of recommendation. I tried to soften the blow in every way possible without raising suspicion. But it didn't work, Richard said, his voice dripping with bitterness. He collapsed anyway. I know. And when I heard about it, when my investigators told me he was depressed, that you were struggling alone to take care of him and pay the bills, I felt like I was dying inside. I offered financial help through intermediaries, but you refused. Because it felt like charity. Because I didn't understand why a company would offer so much money to someone they had just fired. Because I was desperate. Because seeing you both suffer over a decision I made was unbearable. Helen wiped away the tears that were starting to fall again. So I decided to do the only thing I knew you wouldn't turn down. I came here. I cleaned your house. I cooked. I took care of the space where you live. It wasn't much, but it was real. Richard sat in silence for a long time, processing everything. The story made sense in a disturbing, complex way. Every piece fit, even the ones he didn't want to accept. Does my dad know? He finally asked. Does he know you exist? No, at least I don't think so. My mother said in the letter that she never told him about the pregnancy. She just vanished, moved cities, changed her name, built a new life. So he has a daughter and doesn't even know it. He does. And I've spent the last 3 years watching him from afar, desperately wanting to reach out, but knowing I couldn't. Knowing it would be selfish of me to disrupt his life just because I needed a father. Richard stood up again and walked to the small window overlooking the building's inner courtyard. Outside, clothes swayed on a neighbor's clothesline. Life was going on as normal for everyone but him. "I need to think," he said without turning around. "This is too much to process in one night." "I understand." Helen stood up as well, grabbing the expensive purse she had left on a chair. "I didn't expect you to believe me immediately. I didn't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know the truth." She walked to the door, but before leaving, turned back one last time. "Richard, I left my card on the living room table. If you want to talk, if you want me to prove anything I've said, call me. I can show you my mother's letter, the documents, even take a DNA test if you want." "DNA?" Richard repeated, turning to face her. "You would do that?" "I would. I know my word means nothing to you right now. But science doesn't lie." Richard nodded slowly. "I'll think about it." Helen opened the door but hesitated on the threshold. "Your father, how is he doing today?" "Physically? I mean, weak, thin. He barely eats. He spends all day lying down, staring at the ceiling. The doctors said there's nothing physically wrong with him to justify his condition. It's like he just gave up." "People can die of a broken heart," Helen said softly. "It happens more often than you'd think." "He's not going to die," Richard said, with a fierceness that surprised them both. "I won't let him." Helen smiled sadly. "I believe you. Good night, Richard." "Good night, Helen." And then she was gone, leaving behind only the subtle scent of an expensive perfume and a truth that would change everything. Richard stood perfectly still in the kitchen for a long time after she left. Finally, he walked to his father's room. The door was cracked open, as always. He pushed it slowly, letting the hallway light illuminate the thin figure lying in bed. "Dad," he whispered, knowing there would be no answer. Arthur Miller was awake, as he often was, his eyes wide open, staring at nothing. He didn't turn when Richard entered, gave no sign he had even registered his presence. Richard walked up to the bed and sat on the edge. He studied the face of the man who had raised him, looking for similarities with the woman who had just walked out of his house. The brown eyes, yes, the jawline, the shape of his hands. "You had a daughter," Richard said quietly, not expecting a reply. Before you married Mom, and she grew up without you, just like I grew up without Mom after she passed." Arthur blinked, but didn't move. "She's the CEO of the company that fired you, but she fired you to protect you, Dad. To protect your name, your family, your dignity. She's your daughter, and you don't even know." Richard felt his own tears start to fall. 3 months of exhaustion and despair finally finding an outlet. "And I don't know what to do with this information. I don't know if I tell you, if I seek her out again, or if I pretend none of this ever happened. But I do know one thing. You need to get better. You need to go back to being the man who raised me, who taught me how to fix engines and to never give up. Because now, there are more people who need you. There's a daughter out there who spent her whole life without a father, and you have a chance to meet her." Richard wiped his eyes and squared his shoulders. "So you're going to get better, Dad, because I'm not going to let you give up. Not now that I know there's more to the story than I thought." He stood up, adjusted the blanket over his father, and left the room. On the living room table, he found the card Helen had left. Thick paper, gold-embossed letters. Helen Vance, CEO, Vance Motors. On the back, written by hand in delicate script, was a cell phone number and a message for when you're ready to hear more. Richard tucked the card into his wallet and went to his own room. But that night, for the first time in months, it wasn't just exhaustion keeping him awake. It was the impossible possibility that his family was bigger than he had ever believed, and that maybe, just maybe, there was still hope of saving them all. 3 days passed before Richard called. They were 3 days of grueling shifts at the auto shop, of silent meals trying to get his father to eat at least a few spoonfuls of soup, of restless nights tossing in bed thinking about everything Helen had said. He spent those days watching Arthur with new eyes, looking for signs, clues, Anything that would confirm or deny the absurd story he'd been told. On the morning of the fourth day, a Saturday, Richard took the card from his wallet and dialed the number. Helen answered on the second ring. "Hello? It's Richard." He was standing on the apartment's small balcony, watching the city wake up under a cloudy sky. "Are you busy?" There was a brief pause. "Never too busy for you. Do you need something?" "I need to see the letter and the documents, everything you have." "When?" "Today, if possible. I'll send my driver to pick you up in an hour." Richard hesitated. The idea of getting into a chauffeured car felt like it belonged to a different world than his. "Can we meet somewhere neutral? A coffee shop, maybe?" "Of course. Do you know Lou's Diner, near Union Station?" Richard knew it. It was a simple place frequented by workers and commuters, where the coffee was decent and the pie was even better, a place where he wouldn't feel completely out of place. "I know it. Let's meet there at noon." "I'll be there." Richard hung up and stared at the phone for a long moment. He was really doing this. He was actually considering that Helen's story might be true. He went back inside, made breakfast, and tried once again to coax his father into eating. Arthur accepted a few spoonfuls of oatmeal, but his eyes remained empty, distant. Richard talked about his day, about a particularly stubborn car he'd fixed at the shop, about the forecast calling for rain. Anything to fill the silence. "I'm going out for a few hours today," he said while wiping the corner of his father's mouth with a napkin. "I have to take care of some things. Mrs. Higgins is going to check in on you, okay?" Mrs. Higgins was the neighbor from the apartment next door, a 70-year-old woman who had offered to help after hearing about Arthur's situation. It was one of the few kindnesses Richard had accepted, mostly because the woman wouldn't take no for an answer. At 11:45, Richard was ready. He put on his best shirt, a light blue button-down his mother had bought him years ago, and a pair of jeans free of grease stains. He stopped by the neighbors, thanked her again for the help, and headed down the stairs toward the L train station. The trip downtown took 40 minutes. Richard used the time to organize his thoughts, to prep the questions he wanted to ask. But when he walked out of the station and headed toward the diner, he realized he had no idea where to start. Helen was already there when he arrived. She was sitting in a corner booth, dressed surprisingly casually in dark jeans and a simple white blouse. No heavy makeup, no immaculate suit. She looked like a regular person, although Richard noted that the handbag next to her probably cost more than 3 months of his salary. "Hi," she said, as he approached, a nervous smile on her lips. "Hi." Richard slid into the booth across from her. "Did you order?" "I was waiting for you. What do you recommend?" "Black coffee and a slice of cherry pie. It's what this place is famous for." Helen waved the waitress over and ordered for them both. When they were alone again, she pulled a leather folder from her bag and set it on the table. "It's all here," she said. "My mother's original letter, photocopies of old factory records showing when she worked there, some photos of her when she was young with your father." Richard opened the folder with hands that shook slightly. The first thing he saw was the letter, several pages written by hand in delicate, slanted cursive. It was in a wax-sealed envelope, something he had only ever seen in movies. "You can read it," Helen said softly. "I brought it so you could." Richard pulled the pages from the envelope with careful reverence. The date at the top was from 3 years ago. He began to read. "My dearest Helen, if you are reading this, I'm already gone. Forgive me for carrying this secret for so long, but now you need to know the truth about your father." Richard read every word, his breathing growing heavier with every paragraph. The letter detailed everything: Christine meeting Arthur for the first time, the hidden lunches, the feelings that grew despite the impossible situation. It described the pain of discovering the pregnancy, the decision to leave, the years of watching from afar as Arthur built a life without ever knowing he had a daughter. There was love in those words, but also regret. Christine didn't regret having Helen, but she regretted never giving Arthur the chance to know her. At the end of the letter, she begged Helen to consider finding him, but only if it wouldn't cause more pain than relief. When Richard finished reading, there were tears in his eyes. He put the letter back in the envelope with the utmost care. "It's real," he said, more to himself than to Helen. "This really happened." "Yes." Helen had tears in her own eyes. And there's more. She pulled out a few old faded photographs from the folder. Richard examined them one by one. The first showed a young, pretty woman with dark hair smiling at the camera. She was standing in front of an industrial brick building that Richard recognized as the old Vance Motors headquarters. "My mother at 22, Helen explained. Her first day of work." The next photo made Richard's heart stop. It was the same woman, but she wasn't alone. Next to her, with his arm casually draped over her shoulders, was a young man in a mechanic's jumpsuit. He was smiling, his eyes shining with a happiness Richard hadn't seen on his father's face in a long time. But he recognized that face. It was Arthur, 35 years younger. "They look happy," Richard whispered. "My mother kept this photo her entire life. It was on her nightstand when she died." There were more photos. Arthur and Christine at a park. Arthur fixing something while Christine watched. One that was just a close-up of the two of them, faces close together, clearly in love. The waitress brought the coffee and the pie, but Richard barely noticed. He was entirely absorbed in the images of a love story he never knew existed. "Was your mother his first girlfriend?" Richard asked. "I don't know. She never mentioned other women in the letter, but they meant a lot to each other. That much is clear." Richard picked up one of the photos, the one showing them both in the park. "Can I keep this one?" "You can keep them all if you want. I made copies for myself. Just this one. I think my dad should have at least one memory of her, even if he doesn't know what it means yet." Helen nodded, understanding. They sat in silence for a moment, drinking the coffee that was slowly cooling. "You look like her," Richard said suddenly. "In the eyes. The way you smile out of the corner of your mouth when you're nervous." Helen touched her own face subconsciously. "My grandmother used to say that I was the spitting image of Christine. And you look like him too, like our dad." The word felt strange coming out of his mouth, but also strangely right. "I noticed on the first night, but I didn't want to admit it." "I know. I saw pictures of you before we met. All three of us have the same eyes." Richard picked up his fork and poked at his pie, but didn't take a bite. He just held it, needing something to do with his hands. "What happens now?" "I don't know. I'm leaving that up to you. We can do the DNA test if you still have doubts. We can tell your father. We can do nothing and go back to how things were. The choice is yours. It can't be just my choice. This affects all of us. But you're the one taking care of him. You're the one who knows his condition better than anyone. If you think knowing about me will hurt him more, then I understand. I can go back to just being someone who cleans your house on Thursdays." Richard finally took a bite of the pie, chewing thoughtfully. "He's dying, Helen, not physically, but inside. He gave up. And I don't know how to bring him back. Maybe knowing he has a daughter could give him a reason. Or it could destroy what little is left of him. It could make him feel guilty, like he betrayed my mom, even if technically he didn't." Technically, he was engaged. Even if he wasn't officially married yet, there was a commitment. My mom was a traditional woman. If she knew about you, about your mother, she would have been devastated. "I know, and that's one of the reasons I never wanted this to come to light. I don't want to tarnish the memory of a woman who never did anything wrong." Richard looked at Helen, truly seeing her for the first time. Not as the CEO who ruined his father's life, but as a person who was also lost, also hurting, also looking for a place to belong. "Do you have anyone?" he asked. "A husband, boyfriend, close friends?" Helen laughed dryly. "I have co-workers. I have people who want things from me. I have an efficient assistant who organizes my life, but knows nothing about it. As for real relationships," she shook her head, "I don't have time. Or maybe I never learned how. You're lonely. Immensely. And finding out I have a living father and brother was like finding water in the desert, but water I don't know if I can drink without consequences." Richard finished his coffee, considered ordering another, and decided against it. "I'll make you an offer. I'm listening. Let's take it slow. Let's get to know each other first, you and me. Build something real before we bring my dad into this, because if we're going to tell him, we need to do it as a family, not as strangers bearing upsetting news." Helen leaned forward, hopeful. "Are you saying you want to get to know me better?" I'm saying that if we're siblings, then we need to act like siblings. And siblings aren't just people who share blood. They're people who care about each other, who show up, who build memories together. I would really like that. But there are rules, Richard continued. No money, no expensive gifts, no trying to solve my problems with your fortune. If we're doing this, we do it as people, not as CEO and mechanic. Agreed. And you keep coming on Thursdays, but no more sneaking around. You ring the doorbell. You meet my dad properly, not as an executive, but as his son's friend. Helen smiled, and it was the first genuine smile Richard had seen from her. I can do that. Then we have a deal. Richard extended his hand across the table. Helen shook it, and in that moment they sealed not just an agreement, but the beginning of something neither of them fully understood yet, but that both desperately needed. The first official Thursday started with Richard more nervous than he'd been since his first job interview. He had spent the afternoon scrubbing the apartment, something Helen usually did, but that now felt important to do himself. He made a simple dinner, meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans. Nothing fancy, but made with care. At exactly 7 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Richard took a deep breath, wiped his hands on his apron, and went to open the door. Helen stood there, still in her work clothes. But there was something different about her. Maybe it was the way she smiled, more relaxed, more genuine. Hi, she said, holding up a bakery box. I know you said no gifts, but I brought dessert. I bought it at a regular bakery. Nothing extravagant, I promise. Richard peeked inside the box and saw a cherry pie. Pie is acceptable, come in. Helen stepped inside, and for the first time was welcomed properly as a guest, not as an intruder or a secret. Richard led her to the small living room, where Arthur was sitting in his armchair looking out the window as he so often did. Dad, Richard said softly, kneeling beside the armchair. We have company. This is Helen, a friend of mine. Helen, this is my father, Arthur. Helen approached carefully, as if nearing something precious and fragile. She knelt down as well, bringing herself into Arthur's line of sight. Hello, Mr. Miller, she said, her voice heavy with emotion she was fighting to control. It's an honor to meet you. Arthur slowly turned his eyes toward her. For a moment, just a fleeting moment, there seemed to be a flicker of recognition, of curiosity. But then his eyes drifted back to the window, back to nothing. Helen looked at Richard, who just gave a gentle shake of his head. He has good days and bad days. Today is an okay day. He's handsome, Helen whispered. Even now, you can tell he was a handsome man. My mom used to say she fell in love with his smile first, that when he smiled, the whole world seemed brighter. Helen discreetly wiped her eyes. My mother said something similar in her letter. They stayed there for a few more minutes, just sitting near Arthur, filling the silence with small talk about the day, the weather, things that didn't matter, but created an atmosphere of normalcy. Eventually, Richard stood up. Shall we eat? It's nothing special, but it's real food. Real food is perfect. They helped Arthur up and guided him to the kitchen table. Richard served the plates while Helen helped the old man sit comfortably. There was a gentleness in how she treated him, a care that went beyond mere politeness. Richard realized she had done this before during her secret visits. Dinner was quiet. Richard and Helen talked about light subjects, steering clear of heavy topics. She talked about her day at the company, but differently, focusing on the people instead of the numbers, the stories instead of the strategies. He talked about the shop, about the classic car he was restoring in his spare time, about his small but meaningful dreams. Arthur ate little, but he ate, and though he didn't speak, his eyes darted between the two young people at the table, as if trying to puzzle out what was happening. After dinner, while Richard washed the dishes, Helen sat in the living room with Arthur. Richard could hear her speaking softly, telling stories about her mother, about growing up an only child, about the loneliness of always having everything but having no one. You know, Mr. Miller, she was saying, I always wanted a big family. Brothers, cousins, those chaotic Sunday get-togethers. But it was just me and my mum. She was wonderful, don't get me wrong. But there were times when I'd look at other families and feel an envy so deep it hurt. Richard finished the dishes, dried his hands, and walked into the living room. Coffee? I'd love some. He brewed a pot, poured 3 simple mugs, and the 3 of them sat in a silence that was surprisingly comfortable. The television was on low, some variety show, but no one was really watching. Richard told me you worked at Vance Motors for 40 years, Helen said suddenly, looking at Arthur. That's incredible. My company, the company I work for, needs more dedicated people like that. Richard noted her careful choice of words. She wasn't lying, but she wasn't revealing the whole truth either. Not yet. He started as an apprentice mechanic, Richard added. He was only 22, worked his way through every department until he became a supervisor. You must be very proud of him, Helen said, looking at Richard but speaking clearly for Arthur. I am. Always have been. He taught me everything about cars, about honesty, about hard work. Everything I am, I owe to him. Arthur blinked slowly, and Richard could have sworn he saw the glint of a tear in the corner of his eye. The rest of the night passed in a pleasant haze. Helen helped Richard put Arthur to bed, and for the first time in months the old man seemed to sleep peacefully, rather than just shutting his eyes to the world. They returned to the kitchen, where Helen insisted on cutting and serving the pie. They sat at the table once more, and the silence now was just 2 siblings existing in the same space. Thank you for this, Helen finally said, for letting me be here, for letting me meet him properly. It means more to me than you can imagine. I know what it's like to grow up without a complete family, Richard replied. I lost my mom when I was 18. Those were tough years, especially at first. If I can help someone not feel so alone, then it's worth it. You're a good man, Richard Miller. I'm trying to be, just like you're trying. Helen bit her lip, visibly struggling with something she wanted to say. Can I ask you a hard question? Go ahead. Have you forgiven me for firing your father? Richard considered the question carefully. I don't know if forgiveness is the right word. I understand why you did it. I even agree it might have been the only option. But that doesn't erase the pain. It doesn't change the fact that my dad is broken. I know, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to fix it, if you let me. Not with money. Not with money, she agreed. With presence, with care, with all the little things money can't buy. Richard reached his hand across the table and Helen held it. Then let's work on this together. Let's bring him back. Let's. In the weeks that followed, a pattern settled in. Every Thursday, Helen came over for dinner. Sometimes they got takeout. Other times they cooked together, making a mess in the small kitchen and laughing at their mistakes. Arthur participated silently, but his presence at the table grew steadier. Helen started coming on other days too. On Saturdays, she helped Richard with household chores, and he taught her practical things she'd never had to learn. How to change a light fixture without calling an electrician. How to fix a leaky faucet. How to make coffee on the stove instead of in a $5,000 espresso machine. Richard, in turn, occasionally visited her at the office. Not in the CEO's suite, but in the company cafeteria, where she insisted on meeting him. There, surrounded by employees who had no idea who she really was when she wore casual clothes, they talked about life, dreams, and fears. Have you ever thought about going to college? Helen asked one day as they shared pulled pork sandwiches. I have. But there was always something more urgent. Bills to pay, my dad to look after, life getting in the way. What if you could go now? What would you study? Mechanical engineering probably, or something related. I like understanding how things work, fixing what's broken. Helen smiled. You already do that. You just don't have the piece of paper saying you can. The piece of paper matters in this world. It does, but it doesn't define who you are. It was during one of these conversations that Richard realized something fundamental. He was starting to genuinely like Helen. Not just tolerate her, not just accept her, but actually enjoy her company. She was funny when she allowed herself to be, intelligent in ways that extended far beyond business, and surprisingly humble considering her position. And Helen, in turn, was blossoming. The tense, tightly wound woman who had walked into his kitchen 2 months ago was gradually transforming into someone lighter, more present, more alive. You've changed, Richard noted one night while they were drying dishes together. I have. You're smiling more. You seem less, I don't know, less like you're carrying the weight of the world by yourself. Helen paused, a mug halfway to the cupboard. I think it's because I'm not alone anymore. For the first time in my life, I have a real family. Small, complicated, but real. It is real, Richard agreed. And it's getting more real every day. But they both knew there was a pending conversation, a truth that still needed to be revealed to Arthur. And the more time passed, the harder it became to decide when and how to do it, until the decision was made for them, in a way neither expected. It was on a cold November morning that everything changed. Richard woke up with a bad feeling, an inexplicable sensation that made him get out of bed earlier than usual. He went straight to his father's room and found him collapsed beside the bed, conscious but unable to get up. "Dad!" Richard rushed to him, lifting him carefully. "What happened? Are you in pain?" Arthur shook his head weakly, but his face was pale, tinged with a greyish hue Richard had never seen before. His hands were cold and trembling. Without a second thought, Richard grabbed his phone and called 911. Then he called Helen. "I'm taking my dad to the hospital," he said, the second she answered. He collapsed. "I don't know what's happening." "Which hospital?" Helen's voice was instantly alert, all traces of sleep vanishing. "Chicago General." "I'll be there in 20 minutes. The ambulance arrived quickly. The paramedics examined Arthur, took his blood pressure, and asked questions that Richard answered with a shaky voice. Extreme weakness, severe dehydration, possible cardiac compromise due to prolonged depression. They needed to move him immediately. Richard rode in the ambulance, holding his father's freezing hand the entire way. Arthur kept his eyes open, but there was an acceptance in them that terrified Richard more than any pain could. It was as if the old man was ready to leave, and that resignation was horrifying. "No," Richard whispered, squeezing his dad's hand tightly. "You are not giving up. You have reasons to stay, reasons you don't even know yet. Please, Dad, please hang on." At the hospital, it was a blur of procedures. Arthur was rushed into the ER, hooked up to monitors, sent for tests. Richard paced the waiting room, unable to sit down, unable to stop moving. Helen arrived exactly 19 minutes after his call. She was out of breath, as if she had been running, her hair messy, wearing no makeup and clothes she had clearly thrown on in a rush. "How is he?" were her first words. "I don't know. The doctors are with him. They wouldn't let me stay." Richard's voice broke. "Helen, he was so cold, so weak, like he was already fading." Helen pulled him into a hug, and Richard realized he was shaking. "He's going to be fine. He has to be fine. I can't lose him. I already lost my mum. I can't lose him too." "You won't. He's strong. He'll fight." But as Helen said those words, her own eyes filled with tears. She was just as terrified of losing a father she had barely begun to know. They sat together in the waiting room, fingers intertwined, united in fear and hope. Hours passed in a haze of bad coffee and heavy silence. Finally, a doctor appeared. She was a middle-aged woman in a white coat with a grave expression. "Family of Arthur Miller." Richard shot up from his chair, Helen right behind him. "That's me. I'm his son. How is he?" The doctor gestured for them to sit back down. "Your father suffered acute heart failure compounded by severe malnutrition and dehydration. His body simply stopped functioning properly due to his prolonged depressive state." "Is he going to make it?" Richard asked, the words catching in his throat. "We've stabilized him, but his condition is delicate. Physically, we can treat him, build his strength back up. But the real issue is psychological. Your father has given up on living, and until he finds a reason to fight, any treatment will only be a temporary fix." "What can we do?" Helen asked, her voice steady despite her tears. The doctor looked at her, then at Richard. "Be honest with him. If there are things left unsaid, secrets kept, now is the time to bring them into the light. Sometimes, that's exactly what a person needs to find the will to live again." After the doctor left, Richard and Helen looked at each other. They both knew what had to be done. "It's time," Richard said. "Are you sure? Once we tell him, there's no taking it back." "I'm sure he needs to know he has more than just me. That there's more story here, more family, more reasons to stick around. Helen nodded, wiping her eyes. Then we'll tell him together. They were allowed to see Arthur an hour later. He was in an ICU bed, surrounded by machines beeping in steady rhythms. Tubes and wires connected his frail body to the monitors, but his eyes were open, and for the first time in months there was something in them besides emptiness. There was awareness. Richard approached first, taking his father's free hand. "Hey, Dad, you gave us a scare." Arthur moved his lips, but no sound came out. His hand weakly squeezed Richard's. "Don't try to talk," Richard said softly. "Just listen, okay? There's something very important I need to tell you. Something that's going to change everything." Helen stepped up to the other side of the bed, and Richard saw Arthur's eyes track over to her. There was a flicker of confusion, then something else, something that looked almost like recognition. "Dad, do you remember a woman named Christine Vance? She worked at the plant a long time ago, before you married Mom." Arthur's eyes went wide. His breathing hitched, the monitors reflecting the spike in his heart rate. "I see you remember," Richard continued, keeping his voice calm. "She left suddenly, and you never knew why. But there was a reason, Dad, a very important reason." Helen took a step closer, placing her hand over Arthur's other hand. "Mr. Miller, my name is Helen Vance. Christine was my mother." Tears began to spill from Arthur's eyes, silent but constant. "When my mother left," Helen went on, her own voice breaking, "she was pregnant. Pregnant with me. She never told you because she didn't want to ruin your plans, your life, your future with the woman you loved. So she raised me on her own, told me you had passed away before I was born." Arthur tried to speak again, his mouth forming words that still couldn't find a voice. "She loved you her whole life," Helen said, tears falling freely now. "Every word of the letter she left me was full of love for you. She never married, never found anyone who compared to the kind mechanic who made her happy for a few precious months." Richard squeezed his dad's hand. "And I love you too, Dad. You gave me everything. You taught me everything. You were the best father anyone could ask for. And now you have the chance to be a father again, to get to know an incredible daughter who grew up strong and brilliant, exactly the kind of person you'd be proud of." The monitors showed Arthur's heart racing, but not dangerously. It was the acceleration of emotion, of realization, of something waking up inside him after being dormant for so long. Helen leaned in closer. "I didn't come here to cause trouble or pain. I came because I needed to know you, because I've spent my whole life wondering who you were. And now that I've found you, now that I know you and Richard for the first time in my life, I feel complete." Arthur moved the hand Helen was holding, slowly turning it until he could interlace his fingers with hers. Then he did the same with Richard. And there in that hospital bed, the three of them were connected, an improvised family born of secrets and regrets, but fortified by love. "Please, Dad," Richard whispered. "Please stay. We found you. We all finally found each other. Don't leave us now." Arthur closed his eyes, but it wasn't the closing of surrender that Richard knew so well. It was different. He was resting, not running, and when he opened his eyes again minutes later, there was something in them that hadn't been there for months. There was will. There was purpose. There was life. He still couldn't speak, but his hands squeezed his children's hands with a strength that surprised them both. And in that simple gesture, everything that needed to be said was said. The doctors asked them to step out so Arthur could get some proper rest. Outside the room, Richard and Helen collapsed into chairs in the private waiting area, exhausted emotionally and physically. "We did it," Helen whispered. "We told him. And he didn't turn us away. He held on." "He held on," she repeated, as if she needed to hear it again to believe it. They stayed there for hours, refusing to go home, alternating between restless catnaps in uncomfortable chairs and anxious vigils. Nurses passed by, brought them coffee, told them they could go rest, but neither moved. It was morning when the same doctor from before reappeared. Her face looked different now, softer. "He's asking for you," she said. "Well, not asking with words quite yet, but he gets very agitated when you're not in there." Richard and Helen practically sprinted to the room. Arthur was awake, his eyes shining with a clarity Richard hadn't seen in nearly a year. "Dad," Richard breathed, stepping close. Arthur opened his mouth, and this time, though weak and raspy, a word came out. Son. Richard felt his knees go weak. That voice, that single word, was like music after months of silence. Then Arthur turned his eyes to Helen, and another word came, even harder, even heavier with emotion. Daughter. Helen covered her mouth with her hands, sobs shaking her frame. She leaned over, kissed her father's forehead and whispered, Yes, your daughter, always your daughter. And in that moment, surrounded by machines and the cold lights of a hospital room, a broken family finally began to heal. Arthur's recovery was slow but steady. Each day brought small victories, a few extra spoonfuls of food, a few more minutes awake and alert, a few more words in fragmented conversations. The doctors were amazed by the turnaround, attributing it not just to medical treatment, but primarily to what they called his renewed will to live. Richard and Helen took turns by his bedside, never leaving Arthur alone for too long. They brought photos, told stories, slowly weaving a family narrative that included all three of them. It was during one of these visits, 2 weeks after the initial revelation, that Arthur finally managed to speak in complete sentences. Christine, he said, his voice frail but steady. I looked for her. When she vanished, I went to her apartment, to her parents' house. Nobody knew where she was. Helen held his hand. She didn't want to be found. She thought she was doing the right thing. I loved your mother, Arthur continued, every word clearly costing him effort. But I also loved Richard's mother. I was young, confused. I made choices. They weren't the wrong choices, Richard interjected. They were just choices. And those choices gave me my life, my childhood. I wouldn't trade any of it. Arthur looked at his son, then at the daughter he had just met. I have 2 children. How did I get so lucky? We're the lucky ones, Helen said, to finally be here, to finally be a family. In the weeks that followed, as Arthur regained his strength, the 3 of them began to plan for the future. Helen used her resources to ensure Arthur received the best possible care, not through shady favors, but through her personal premium healthcare network, something both Richard and Arthur reluctantly accepted after much debate. It's not charity, Helen insisted. It's a daughter taking care of her father. It's what families do. And it was true. The dynamic between them had fundamentally shifted. They were no longer strangers trying to figure each other out, but a genuine family with all the complexities and joys that came with it. Arthur was finally discharged on a sunny July afternoon. Richard had scrubbed the apartment top to bottom, and Helen had brought fresh flowers to set in the living room. When they helped Arthur through the door, he paused on the threshold, looking around as if seeing the place for the first time. Home, he said simply. This feels like home. That night, they had their first real dinner as a family. Helen cooked, with Richard helping and making sarcastic comments about her still developing culinary skills. Arthur sat at the head of the table, grinning as his children bickered playfully over the right amount of salt for the gravy. You 2 are alike, he said out of nowhere, making them both stop and look at him. The same eyes, the same stubbornness, the same good heart. Richard and Helen exchanged a glance and smiled. It was true. They were siblings in every way that mattered. The following months brought significant changes for everyone. Arthur, under proper care and with renewed reasons to live, began putting on weight and getting color back in his cheeks. He would never go back to being exactly the man he was before the layoff, but he was becoming a new version of himself, one who embraced both the past and the present. Helen implemented changes at Vance Motors, establishing a relief fund for struggling employees and a rehiring program for those who had been unfairly let go during the crisis. She couldn't undo all the pain the company had caused, but she was trying to make it better, more human. Richard kept working at the auto shop, but with a different perspective now. Helen had offered multiple times to pay for his engineering degree, but he refused, at least for the time being. When I go back to school, he said, it'll be because I'm ready, not just because I have the money sitting there. I want to do things at my own pace. Helen learned to respect that, just as she learned to respect many other things about Richard's life that was so different from her own. Thursdays remained sacred. No matter how busy Helen was, that night was reserved for family. Sometimes they cooked, Sometimes they ordered takeout, sometimes they just sat and talked. Arthur participated more and more, telling stories from his youth, some that Richard knew, others that were completely new to both of his children. On one of those nights, he talked about Christine. She had the most beautiful smile, he said, his eyes far away in a memory. Lit up the whole room, and she was smart. So smart. She should have gone far in the company, but back then women didn't get the same opportunities. She went far anyway, Helen said. She built a consulting firm that became wildly successful. Married my grandfather late in life, and he legally adopted me, but she always kept the name Vance. Said it was the only thing she had left from that time. Was she happy? Arthur asked, his voice heavy with an old guilt. She was. Different from what could have been, but happy. And she never blamed you for anything. The letter made that very clear. Arthur nodded, visibly relieved. I'm glad. She deserved to be happy. Richard watched these exchanges with fascination. Seeing his dad finally open up, finally process feelings he'd buried for decades, was like watching someone step out of a long, dark tunnel. In the fall, Helen made a proposal. I want you guys to see my place, she said during dinner. It's not a palace, don't worry, it's just an apartment that's way too big for one person, and I've been thinking, maybe it doesn't need to be so big or so empty. What are you getting at? Richard asked, though he already knew. I'm suggesting that maybe, just maybe, you'd consider moving in with me. There's more than enough room. We could be a real family under one roof. Richard and Arthur exchanged a look. It was a generous offer, but also a complicated one. I don't know, Helen, Richard said carefully. This apartment, as modest as it is our history. My memories with my mom are here. My early years with my dad are here. I understand, and I'm not asking you to give that up. Maybe we can have both. This place can still be yours, but you'd have a room there too, a sanctuary for when you need it. Arthur chimed in for the first time. I think Helen is right about one thing. A family should be together. Not always, not necessarily under the same roof all the time, but close enough to see each other without effort. Then it's settled, Helen said, excited. I'm not asking you to pack up your whole lives, just to consider having a space there, rooms that belong to you, to make my house our house. It took a few more weeks of debating, but they eventually agreed to at least go look at Helen's apartment. When they arrived, Richard was momentarily speechless. It wasn't the ostentatious mansion he had expected, but it was definitively luxurious compared to what they were used to. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline. The decor was elegant, but not cold, and there were 3 bedrooms besides Helen's master suite. This could be yours, she said to Richard, pushing open the door to a room overlooking the park. And this, she opened another door, could be Mr. Miller's, Dad's. It has an ensuite bathroom, which would be easier for him. Arthur walked into the room slowly, looking around. There were touches of him in the way Helen had decorated it, even before she knew he would ever see it. Earth tones and blues, a comfortable reading chair by the window, space for books and memories. You planned this? He said. I did, Helen admitted. Ever since I found out you two existed, I've dreamed of the day we could be a real family. This room was always yours in my head. Richard saw the tears in his father's eyes and felt his own welling up. We don't have to decide right now, he said, but maybe we can start spending some weekends here, see how it feels. And that's what they did. Little by little, Helen's apartment became a second home. Clothes started appearing in the closets, toothbrushes in the bathrooms, photos on the walls. The line between Helen's place and our place blurred more and more. Christmas arrived with Chicago decked out in lights and promises. It was the first holiday in years that Richard genuinely looked forward to, instead of just resigning himself to enduring it. Helen insisted on cooking a full holiday dinner, even though none of the 3 actually knew how to roast a turkey properly. Let's just order takeout, Richard suggested, after the 3rd minor disaster in the kitchen. Absolutely not, Helen shot back, stubborn. Families cook together on Christmas. Families also eat together on Christmas, and we won't be eating anything if we burn it all down, he retorted. Arthur, sitting at the kitchen island with a cookbook open in front of him, laughed. It was a light, genuine sound that made both of his kids stop and stare. You're laughing, Helen said, amazed. "You two are ridiculous," Arthur replied, still smiling. "But you're my ridiculous kids. And we are going to make this turkey work, even if it takes all night." It took almost all night, but they pulled it off. The dinner wasn't perfect, but it was made with love and joint effort. They ate late. It was past midnight by the time they finally sat down to their slightly lopsided but entirely homemade feast. A toast. Helen raised her glass of sparkling cider, since none of them were drinking alcohol. "To the family we chose and the family we found. To second chances," Richard added. "To love that sticks around even when everything says it shouldn't," Arthur finished. They clinked their glasses, and the clear sound echoed through an apartment full of life, warmth, and belonging. After dinner, they exchanged simple gifts. Richard gave Helen a key, a spare key to the apartment on the outskirts of the city. "So you always know you have a place with us no matter where it is," he told her. Helen cried, hugged her brother tightly, and then handed both him and Arthur a flat box. Inside were photo albums she had meticulously put together, pictures of young Christine, photos of her and Arthur together that Richard never knew existed, pictures of Helen's childhood interwoven with photos of Richard's. It was a visual history of a family that had existed apart for so long and was finally coming together. "I wanted us all to have the complete story," Helen explained. "What was, what is, and what can still be." Arthur held the album with trembling hands, turning the pages slowly, pausing on every picture of Christine as if memorizing a face he had never truly forgotten. "She would have loved you," he said to Helen. "She would have been so incredibly proud of the woman you became." "And Richard's mother?" Helen asked carefully. "How do you think she would have reacted to all this?" Arthur thought for a long moment. "Your mother," he said to Richard, "was a woman with a massive heart. At first she would have been hurt, surely, but eventually she would have understood, and she would have embraced you, Helen, as part of the family. That's just who she was." "I wish I could have met her," Helen said softly. "She would have liked to meet you too." The night ended with the three of them watching an old movie in the living room, Arthur dozing between his two kids on the oversized sofa. Richard and Helen exchanged a look over their dad's head, a look of mutual understanding and profound gratitude. They had started as strangers, then as wounded people trying to navigate an impossible truth. But now, they were truly a family, woven together not just by blood, but by choice, effort, and genuine love. The following months settled into a pleasant routine. Arthur continued to regain his strength, even starting to talk about maybe working again, not in a plant, but perhaps teaching young mechanics, passing his knowledge on to the next generation. Helen flourished in her role at the company, but she now balanced her work with her personal life in a way she never had before. Fridays became just as sacred as Thursdays, days set aside to do nothing but be present with her family. Richard finally enrolled in a few night classes for engineering at a public university. It wasn't a full course load yet, but it was a start, something he was doing for himself, on his own timeline. And every week, without fail, the three of them gathered, sometimes at the modest apartment where it all began, sometimes at Helen's sprawling place in the sky, but always together. It was during one of these gatherings, almost a year after that first chaotic night, when Helen had shown up washing dishes, that Arthur made an announcement. "I want to go back to the company," he said over dinner. "Not to work the line, but Helen told me there's a mentorship program she's putting together, veteran employees teaching the new hires. I want to be part of it." Helen broke into a huge grin. "Are you sure? Isn't it too soon?" "I'm 63 years old and I finally feel alive again. It's not too soon, if anything, it's late. But I want to do this. I want to pass on what I started 40 years ago. Then let's make it happen," Helen said, already mentally shifting schedules to make room for it. Richard watched the exchange with a smile on his face. His dad was back, not exactly the way he used to be, but maybe better, more complete, more at peace with himself. Life wasn't flawless. There were still hard moments. Days when Arthur's depression tried to creep back in. Nights when Helen felt crushed by the weight of her responsibilities. Mornings when Richard woke up exhausted from burning the candle at both ends. But now, they faced those hardships together. Arthur had 2 kids to lean on. Helen had a father and a brother who loved her for who she was, not for her title or her bank account. Richard had an extended family that filled up spaces in him he hadn't even known were empty. On Sunday afternoons, it became a tradition for the three of them to walk through the park near Helen's place. Arthur still tired easily, but he insisted on walking the whole loop, stopping occasionally to rest on benches under the large oak trees. It was during one of these walks, while Arthur was sitting on a bench resting, and Helen and Richard were standing near the duck pond, that Richard finally voiced something he'd been thinking for months. "You saved us," he said, not looking at Helen. "When you showed up that night, I thought it was the end of everything, but it was just the beginning." Helen rested her head on her brother's shoulder. "We saved each other. I was just as lost as you two. I had money and power, but I had absolutely nothing that actually mattered. And now? Now I have everything. Not because I have more money or more power, but because every Friday I come home and I have people waiting for me. People who care if I had a bad day, who want to hear my boring stories, who laugh at my terrible jokes." "Your jokes are awful," Richard agreed with a smirk. "They really are. But you laugh anyway." Arthur joined them a few minutes later, throwing his arms around both of his kids' shoulders. The three of them stood there watching the sun set over the Chicago skyline, a city of millions where three people had found each other against all odds. "You know what's funny?" Arthur said thoughtfully. "For years, I worked at that plant thinking I was building cars, but I was actually building something much bigger. I was building a family, I just didn't know it yet." "What do you mean?" Helen asked. "If I hadn't worked there, I never would have met Christine. If I hadn't met her, you wouldn't exist. And if you didn't exist, this family we have right now wouldn't exist either. Everything is connected. Every choice, every moment, brought us exactly here." Richard considered that. "So, you don't regret anything?" "I regret a lot of things. I regret not knowing about Helen sooner. I regret getting so lost after I was laid off. I regret the time we lost. But regret doesn't mean I would change it. Because changing anything could mean not having this, right here, right now, with both of you." They walked back to the apartment as the first stars began to peek through the urban sky. Helen's place welcomed them with warm lighting and the smell of fresh coffee her housekeeper had prepped before leaving. They sat in the living room, each in their established spot after months of routine. Helen in her favorite armchair by the window, Richard sprawled on the big couch, Arthur in the rocking chair he had insisted on bringing from the old apartment. "You know," Helen said out of the blue, "I used to hate Fridays." "Why?" Richard asked. "It meant the end of the work week, which was good, but it also meant 2 days of total isolation ahead of me. I worked weekends a lot, just to have something to do so I wouldn't have to be alone with my own thoughts. And now I count the hours until Friday, because I know I get to be with you guys. I know we're going to cook something questionable, watch some terrible movie Richard picks out, and Dad is going to fall asleep halfway through but insist he was just resting his eyes." Arthur chuckled. "I was resting my eyes." "You were snoring, Dad," Richard pointed out. "Minor detail." They laughed together, a sound that filled the apartment with a joy that hadn't existed before they found each other. The evening progressed in a familiar, comforting sequence of rituals. A simple dinner, talk about the day, plans for the week ahead. Arthur taking his meds under the watchful eyes of both his kids. Helen quickly checking emails while Richard washed the dishes. The evening news humming in the background, supplying noise that none of them were really paying attention to. Around 10 o'clock, Arthur announced he was going to bed. He kissed each of his children on the forehead, a gesture that had become a nightly tradition, and walked slowly down the hall to his room. Richard and Helen stayed in the living room, the silence between them comfortable and worn in. "Do you think he's really okay?" Helen asked after a while. "Or is he just putting on a brave face so we don't worry?" "A little of both, probably, but he's better. Much better than he was, and he keeps getting better every day. Because of us. Because he has a reason to live again." Helen stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the illuminated grid of the city below. "Sometimes I still can't believe this is real, that I have a family, that I'm not alone anymore." Richard walked over and stood beside her. "You're never going to be alone again. Not you, not me, not him. We're a unit now. A highly dysfunctional unit sometimes. All families are. But it's our dysfunction, and I wouldn't trade a second of it. They stood there, brother and sister, looking out at the city that had brought them together in such unexpected ways. Out there, millions of people were living their lives, each with their own stories of loss and discovery, of pain and healing. But in that apartment, on that night, 3 people who had been lost were finally found. And in the process of finding each other, they discovered not just a family, but a home. The city lights twinkled like earthly stars, each one representing a life, a story, a possibility. And somewhere among all those points of light, the story of Arthur, Richard, and Helen kept unfolding, one chapter at a time. It wasn't a perfect story. It had started with lies of omission, decades-old secrets, and a twist of fate that could easily never have happened. But it had evolved into something true and enduring. And maybe, Richard thought as he looked at his sister beside him and his father sleeping down the hall, maybe that was the secret to every real family. You aren't born perfect. You choose to become real. Day after day, moment after moment, choosing to show up, choosing to forgive, choosing to love. "I'm making coffee," Helen said suddenly. "You want some?" "Always." And as she walked to the kitchen and Richard followed her, as the sound of clinking mugs and boiling water filled the apartment, as life carried on in its sweet, mundane routine, a family that shouldn't have existed, but did anyway, found its peace. Because in the end, it didn't matter how you became a family. What mattered was that you chose to keep being one, day after day, Friday after Friday, moment after shared moment, and they were choosing it. Every single day they were choosing it. The end. If the journey of Richard, Helen, and Arthur touched your heart, know that we have more emotional stories waiting for you on this channel. Stories about second chances, about the power of forgiveness, about families built not just by blood, but by the conscious choice to show up in each other's lives. If you made it this far, leave a like to show us that this story resonated with you. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the upcoming narratives we prepare with so much care. And in the comments, tell us, do you believe in second chances? Have you ever had a moment where you realized your family was bigger than you thought? Your stories matter just as much as the ones we tell here. Until next Friday, when we will meet again for another emotional journey. A big hug from our entire team. And remember, sometimes the best families are the ones we build with courage, love, and persistence.